Ginza is the prestige shopping area in the center of modern Tokyo. It's the place where new fashions, new lifestyles are introduced and then spread all across the country. And in the early part of the 20th century, out in regional towns, regional cities all over Japan, people renamed an area in the center of the city Ginza, the little Ginzas. Those Ginzas are still there, but there are no new Ginzas. New shopping areas all are taking unusual names, mostly names created out of foreign words. Words such as plaza, or even more interesting, words such as green pia, green from English green, pia from topia, the Greek for place. This change in names is a small thing in and of itself, but it symbolizes what seems like a major shift in Japanese life, with people all over Japan no longer taking their cues from the Ginza, no longer taking their cues from Tokyo, but reaching out directly to the whole wider world.
Of course, the interesting thing is not just that there are no new Ginzas, it's really that that whole shift, and it's a shift that's taken place over several decades. 20 years ago, a process began when Premier Tanaka proposed that whole reorganization of the Japanese islands. Now, of course, that all fell apart in the corruption of the Tanaka cabinet, but the process really began then, and now we're seeing a culmination of it in a change in people's views of themselves and of their world. David and I have been here in Japan for some time now, trying to understand these changes, trying to get a sense of what's really going on out in the regions and of how the regions feel about the center, because that shift is being reflected in that relationship between the center and the region. We're producing a series of documentary programs which will give a sense of what's really happening in individual people's lives out in small-town Japan. When you think about it, David, where do we begin? That is, where do we see the changes really appearing in a way that we can identify and begin to understand them?
I'd begin not in Japan, but in the world scene. I think it's important not to see this change as something that just happened a couple of years ago when somebody or other officially declared the end of the Cold War. This is a long-term set of waves of change, tides of change, that began at least in 1945 under the Allied occupation, when various forms of political power were devolved down to local and regional governments.
Well, of course, it's not a Japanese phenomenon alone. It's not in no sense unique. Japan is part of what's happening all over the industrial world. People are, in a sense, giving up on the center. They really don't feel that the center has answers for them, and the center seems to be equally confused. I suppose in one sense, we would say that it came into focus in 1989 with the Takeshita cabinet and that gift of 100 million yen to every small town and city in Japan. Isn't that really kind of the breakover point when you can see, aha, the center itself isn't sure?
That seems to symbolize it very nicely. For the first time that I know of in the modern century, Tokyo as the pace setter for the entire nation, not just in lifestyles and things like that, but in every arena of Japanese society, for the first time seemed to say, we no longer know what to do for certain. Because if there's a major difference that I see between Japan and other industrial societies over this past century, it's been in the effectiveness of that central bureaucracy.
People have really looked to the center.
Have looked to the center,
assumed that
have
that's
generally
where it was coming
accepted,
from. Yeah.
not simply or naively or narrowly, but have generally accepted that the central leadership, and particularly the bureaucracy, are indeed dedicated civil servants who have everybody's best interests at heart, at least the majority interest.
Now, of course, Another aspect of this that's brought it into focus has been, of course, we say the end of the Cold War, but really the bankruptcy of ideology. Neither socialism nor capitalism have the answers to how do you create a new relationship with people, between people in the
I don't think anybody has the answers. So,
right.
you know, as an academic, I often blame the center, you know, those guys there in the Beltway in the U.S., or those guys on Madison Avenue, or in the case of Japan, those people in Tokyo. And that's an easy stance to take. But I don't think social theory has any very good guidelines for the situation we're in. I think we're in one of those enormous tidal changes in the whole world system. We can sense it going on, but we don't have, there's no good perspective on it anywhere.
No, and for Japan, it has a particular coloration here, and in that sense, it's more difficult for people to see that it's part of this larger phenomenon, because, for instance, there isn't the ethnic tension, there isn't the linguistic tension that you have in Europe or in South Asia. So people tend not to put what's going on in Japan in with what's going on elsewhere. But really, it's all part of the same process, isn't it?
I think very much so. But there are no nice headline issues that you can grab and say, like Nagorno-Karabakh or ethnic battles in Yugoslavia or whatever. It's very much there, but it's not the sort of thing that the casual journalist drifting through is even going to see or hear, except perhaps occasionally. One of my favorite examples was last fall in a by-election down in Kochi Prefecture, where one of the candidates was using as his slogan, "Tokyo is farther away than foreign countries." Yeah.
Yes. One of the things we've uncovered has been the sort of tension and conflict between the Tokyo ministries. Who's going to have the initiative in this new ball game, as we call it, with the people who are out in the regions? Is it going to be Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries? Who is it going to be? And the infighting that's going on in Tokyo leads the people out in the regions, again, to feel this sense of nobody knows. Nobody's telling us what to do. They're busy fighting about what to do. And what do we do?
Well, and the context I think that needs to be seen in is that because the central bureaucracy was relatively effective for the roughly first century of Japan's industrialization, there's a very powerful sense in which that bureaucracy is itself the problem now.
Right. No, I think that's certainly the case. Now let's look at some of the issues. One of the things that we've noticed is this whole really massive beginning of a population shift. Now that in itself is going to dictate that the whole thing's going to look differently from the center as well as from out in the provinces, right? Now, what about population? What's going on there?
Well, to way overstate the point, small communities all over Japan, as in most other industrial societies, have become communities of older people.
So there's a kind of chronological shift of population. Now, Udacho, for instance, where we were, has more than 25% of its population over 65.
Right.
And that's not unusual. It's all around the country in small towns you have it. But up until, say, about 1990, what we were seeing was a draining of population out of the regions, right? But then now we're beginning to see the movement the other way. Now, it's talked about in Japan in terms of U-turn and various other jargon.
Yeah, there's population movement back. It's not that dramatic yet, but one of the immediate problems you get into, and nobody's found a good answer for this one yet, is that the younger generations who, by Japanese ideals, should be living under the same roof with the older people, taking care of them, aren't there.
No, they're no longer there. And there's, of course, there are two other phenomena that are impinging here. One is the labor shortage out in the regions, is they are crying for workers. And you see in the newspapers the advertisements or there'll be a seminar in a prefectural capital for college graduates, that is, who are about to graduate. They're in Tokyo in the universities, and there are seminars being put on for them on how you can get a good job out in Nagano, or in Iwate, or in Tochigi, or wherever. So there's that sort of business. Then there's also the issue of quality of life. And it isn't just pollution. It's the whole sense of what it is to be human in the environment, right?
Well, and living space.
Yes.
I mean, the severe shortage of sheer living space in the industrial belt along the Pacific coast. Nobody's happy about that. It costs several $100,000 to buy a sort of nice 3-bedroom, middle-class type house in the Tokyo area.
Right.
Minimum.
Mm-hmm.
That's minimum.
Still, you can buy land and a house for a lot less out in wherever, in the Kansai, on the Japan seaside, on the Japan sea coast. There's a quality of life issue there that is symbolized by space, but isn't just a matter of space. So the chronology and the space issues, both of them, old folks populating the regions, but the space thing, then a countercurrent that is pushing people to go back. And so there's going to be a population shift there that'll make a real difference.
Maybe. I'm not convinced that we're seeing any great population shift yet. I think it may, it certainly may come about, but it won't come about until there are more challenging job opportunities out in the regions.
Well, of course, that's what's on everybody's minds out in the regions. And one of the interesting things we uncovered was this sort of dual role that the economic development person is playing in almost every town and village. Yes, you've got to have economic development, jobs, bring in companies and all that, but at the same time, that same person has to preserve quality of life.
The newest moves toward economic development seem like they, on the surface, like they're environmentally more gentle. It's not at all clear that that's the case. The newest movements are mostly resorts, golf courses, and whatnot. It's not smokestack industry, which now everybody accepts as bad.
No, but last summer in Ibaraki-ken, by I think it was the middle of July, the golf courses in Ibaraki-ken had all used their year's quota of fertilizer for making green grass. And they were being forced by environmental law to stop using fertilizer. And so there was great hullabaloo about that. What are we going to do? How are we going to have how are we going to preserve the golf courses?
But the golf course issue and the resort issue is a good example of these ways in which a system that may have been very effective for all sorts of reasons up until yesterday now is getting in the way of change in the future, and that has to do with restrictions on the use of agricultural land. Now those agricultural land use laws, when they were set up in the 1960s and earlier, perhaps very sensibly at that time, were trying to increase per acre productivity. And they forbade the use of agricultural land for any other reason, for any other purpose at all.
Yes, and of course you couldn't sell it. You couldn't alienate it from agriculture. Yes, so in town after town, they're sort of hung up on how we can't grow rice on this land, we can't have agriculture, but we can't use it for anything else.
Right.
And in fact, one of the places we were going to do a documentary had just gotten into a sort of scandal over under the table shifting the use of land, and then somebody finding out about it, and they were being called on the carpet for really making an illegal shift of the land. And yet they really needed to do that.
Well, and as a follow-up on that, what's been fascinating to see is in the last few months, the Ministry of Agriculture has gotten its mandate redefined. It's still called the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries, but their mission now is to be the Ministry of Local Life, whatever that means.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means. The minute you start saying you're the Ministry of Local Life, then the Ministry of Education is going to say, but we're in charge of education. That's not local
Right.
life.
Yes,
The local
Shakai
government.
Kyoiku impinges on the Ministry of Education's turf. And we see this in a number of the ministries. Here you have education, you have agriculture, fisheries, but you've got, well, what other ministries are going to get? Oh, of course, the Home Ministry, Gigi Show.
The Home Ministry.
And so here they are
National
fighting
Land
in Tokyo.
Agency.
National Land Agency.
The Ministry of Roads and Construction.
Mm-hmm.
Each of these has its own vested interests in defining or controlling some part of local life.
Then there's another whole dimension, and that's the what are called the Daite Kaisha, Kaihatsu Kaisha, the big money with the big construction companies, who are these fellows are moving out to sort of mastermind and bring big capital investment into the development process, and that's creating tension. It's very interesting in Takata, where we did one of the documentaries, how people were very much concerned about figuring out how to do it for themselves and not bring in big money from outside because of the way that was going to distort the whole process. And yet, of course, they needed capital. How do you get both of those? Those are sort of mujun, contradictions, that every one of these regions and communities are working at.
The phrase you used a minute ago, to me, is a key one. People now are deciding they have to do it themselves. That means they have to figure out how to do it themselves.
Well, and of course, that's what comes back to that 1989, the 100 million yen thing, the Furusato Sosei Undo, where it was symbolic, but it was also real, that Tokyo didn't know what to do, and so they gave this big chunk of block grant money to every town and village saying, you try something, because we don't know. And so all of a sudden people were not just symbolically, but really faced with, well, what do we do? And some of them did silly things, like build a Statue of Liberty or buy a gold brick. But other people, for instance, this one town where the population is more than 25% over 65, they put some of that money into building an old folks' home for winter. So you have some really creative responses.
Historically, I'll argue that at least on a neighborhood level, a small hamlet level, you've always had a great deal of de facto local self-regulation, self-control, not independence, but kind of, we'll take care of our neighborhood and keep, whether it was the samurai in the past or the modern bureaucrats in the 20th century, kind of keep them at a distance. As long as they don't bother us too much, we can handle our own. Mm-hmm. But with local government consolidations, first in the 1950s, increasingly in other levels since then, what I'm seeing are senses of local self-control, self-regulation, moving, in a sense, up the ladder to larger units of local government.
Well, I think that's right, and the regional thing. Well, one of the symbols, but one of the realities is the desire for their own international airport. And of course, the new Kansai International Airport is the lead one in this, and those people down there really think that they're going to do a number on Tokyo. That is, that this is going to give them direct access to bypass Tokyo. But other people also have that same sense. The people up in the Tohoku will say, well, at least in Sendai we should have an international airport and a way to have access to the outside world that Tokyo doesn't have control over and none of their business, in a sense.
Well, I think for the national leadership throughout the modern period, the horror scenario has always been that, go back to 1600, when Japan was broken up into some 240, 250 little fiefdoms.
Right.
And that if you're not careful, that kind of regional identity will resurface. And it does every so often. I mean, most of it's kind of in the form of reconstructions of old festivals and things of that sort. But there are also, and you've seen a lot of these, proposals that are floated every few months. Shouldn't we divide Japan into, let's say, 8 states and form a confederation instead of a single central national state?
Well, of course, that raises this whole question of local culture, and how large a region can this be? One of the things that we ran into, or we were hearing people talk about, was the bonchi idea. That is, the basin the cultural basin idea. And of course, Tono is the most obvious example, but it's only one among, what, tens of these. And people
At least tens, if not hundreds. Yeah.
And now those folks, one of the most interesting divergences we see is instead of people thinking about how do we all look alike, how do we all look different? How can we really now distinguish ourselves even from the people across the mountain?
Yeah, that's part of, I always like the Freudian term, a narcissism of petty differences to indicate how you differ from your neighbors. But what I see is happening now as never before is that foreign items are being brought in as part of a way to establish my town's unique identity versus your town's. So that you get, for example, out somewhere in one of the Japan Sea provinces, an Amazon museum. Not a museum of local history, you have that too. An Amazon
So
museum.
they've gone to South America to get their model of how to be distinctive.
Another small town actually has begun to make a name for itself internationally among aficionados because it has an annual worldwide Bach festival.
That's right. That one in Miyagi-Ken, wasn't it?
So it's part of positioning yourself not only no longer just with respect to Tokyo, but with respect to your neighbors as well. Creating some kind of new identity that draws very widely on items from culture. Not all over the world, they still tend to be mainly from the West. Interestingly enough, not that much yet from Asia, for all that at the national level, national leaders in Japan keep saying, well, but we're part of Asia, we are part of Asia, but that doesn't show up concretely very effectively.
No, but you do see in these local towns, I think one of the most interesting things we heard people talking about was the way in which the local village office, the local mayor's initiative, of course, would send actually workers from the village office abroad. In one town, they were sending some to Germany as well as the United States. And when you talk to these people, it was very interesting to see what they had to say. You remember that fellow in Toa who was saying, you know, I had never seen Japan from the outside, and my mind was stuck in a rut. Now Japan looks different to me, really different.
Looking at Japan, not through Tokyo's eyes anymore,
Right.
but through somebody else's.
Through somebody else's eyes. And then, of course, people coming in. Now, one town that we were in, they had two young high school students from the Shetland Islands.
Yeah.
And in another town, Tono is it, that has a sister city relationship with Salerno in Italy.
Yeah.
And there are places that have sister city relationships with China.
Oh, quite a few, yes.
Right. And so this whole process really has some momentum now. And the cultural redefinition that's going on is something that really we've never seen before.
It makes this an interesting time to be alive in. You know, you're the historian, but when I read Japanese history, to me, one of the most exciting periods of the past was the first decade or so of the Meiji era, 1870, 1880, thereabouts, when Japan, after 250 years of being relatively closed, opened itself, at least to the West, if not to the rest of the world.
Right. But of course, if you were living in that time, as you go back and read those first-hand accounts, it was a sort of terrifying time because everything was up for grabs. What kind of clothes do you wear? What language do you use? All those.
Yeah, but the anthropologist in me says, in world history, that was a very unusual case of directed, rapid cultural change. It didn't just filter in over a long period of time, within a decade roughly. But it was led from the top. Well, and what's happening now is Japan is opening up in a new way, but it's coming from the bottom.
It is coming from the bottom, but you know, that phenomenon is interesting because it's happening in the United States. And there, it's not coming from the top in terms of Washington, but in each state, these directors of economic development are deliberately bringing in not just Japanese, though many Japanese business people, but also Europeans, German, French, British, of course. And that phenomenon is doing the same thing in the American scene that is going on in this scene. So where does this leave us, Dave? What we're seeing in Japan, we've said, is part of a worldwide phenomenon. But how do we, you know, what about regionalism?
Well, there are two kinds of regionalism.
Right.
One, regionalism within Japan itself, but also the kind of regionalism in terms of the larger global scene. It's mostly being talked about as economic regionalism, you know, a Southeast Asian bloc, a North Atlantic bloc. The main way in which you see that right now in Japan is in terms of a Japan-Sea regionalism that's beginning to be talked about. Exchanges are beginning to go on, economic, cultural, and otherwise. Japan, the two Koreas, China, and CIS, the former Soviet Union. Aside from that, of course, looking eastward, you have to go several thousand miles before you get anything other than the new island nations of the Central and Southern Pacific.
Right, so
Japan does not seem to be moving in that direction for regionalism. But you've got two kinds of regionalism going on.
Right, but what it really adds up to is people are trying to create a new definition of themselves, who they are, and of their place in the world. Isn't that really what we're seeing? And Japan is part of a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, and that's why I like that little PIA that's being put on the end of so many place names in Japan now. Here it's coming from ancient Greek. I mean, in English we know it mainly from the word utopia.
Right.
And Japanese are saying, we're located now, our place is somehow in some larger global setting.
Right.
Not clear what that is. I don't think anybody knows exactly where all of this is going. I like a phrase, I think it's from Kierkegaard, who said, life can only be understood backwards, but we have to live it forwards.
I think that's the truth.